A dash of nostalgia combined with a pinch of curiosity is just a part of the recipe two veteran food writers cook up between the pages of their new book.
You know, you want to taste the past, you want to taste the history, you want to be able to then take that food and transport you from the past to the present.
Historian and culinary writer Suzanne Corbett and food and travel writer Deborah Reinhardt dish out recipes and interesting nuggets from Missouri's past about the food that made history.
I think that the different ethnic groups that came to make Missouri home layers our food history kind of like a cake.
Whether it's food or beverages, readers will find what's old is new again, taking us back over 200 years.
We were the breadbasket of the New World.
Learn how to make acorn financiers or pawpaw pudding, and find out how Springfield, Missouri became the birthplace of cashew chicken.
So every city's got its own food story, and many are very adept at telling that to visitors.
Suzanne and Deborah, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate you being here today.
Our pleasure.
Our pleasure.
We gave our viewers a little tidbit about your backgrounds, but let's talk a little bit more. And Suzanne, I'll start with you. I've known you for many years. But one thing I didn't know is that you really do have a strong background in cooking.
Yes, I do. I started out as a cook. I started as a confectioner, a caterer. I began teaching cooking many years ago, and cooking led myself into the path of interpretive work because I've always had a love for history. And I kind of come from an old-fashioned background because my parents were, most parents' age of somebody's grandmother at the time. So I was raised with many old techniques and foodways like canning and baking bread and things like that. So I always had an affection for that. But then I got into media and writing, and here I am today. But I've kind of gone full circle with it.
And Deborah, you worked for AAA, food
Yes.
and travel writers. You did food, but you also a travel writer.
Yes.
And the two have always gone hand in hand for you?
Yes, I think food and travel, you really can't separate them. And my experiences with traveling throughout the state introduced me to some of these foods. But certainly the research that I did for the half of the book I was responsible for really opened my eyes to a lot of the different history that we have here.
So, ladies, you write about Missouri history through food. Those things go together, don't they? I'll start with you, Suzanne.
Of course they do, because food tells the story. Food is what encouraged the settlement here in the first place. Because if you don't have a solid food source, you're not going to stick around. So you have to be able to feed yourself. And if you have great commodities, then you have a place that you can then earn money, and a city and a settlement can flourish. And that's exactly what Missouri did, from the banks of the Mississippi all the way across the state.
And starting with even before we were founded, with the Native Americans and even some of the slave trade that came over. You talk about all of that and how that kind of helped mold Missouri. It goes back over 200 years in your book. Was it tough to find these recipes that you share?
Well, the recipes are what we really wanted to drive the book, because that's the way I think people really are most interested, and that's what set this book apart from other histories and culinary histories about Missouri. But for me, it wasn't hard, because I wrote basically the last 100 years, and so some of these recipes were shared with me either through chefs, current chefs, or they were on company sites. For instance, we have some recipes from Otts. That got their start along Route 66, and so some corporations had them ready for the picking, so to speak, and then some of the really older recipes or receipts, I guess, as they would have been called back then, Suzanne modified for today's cook.
Right. Because what would be different from today versus then? Would it be the type of flour we use, just the ingredients that were available back? Let's say, when you talk a lot about St. Genevieve in those early chapters, because the influence that the French had in that part of the state?
Well, talking about the ingredients are different because just of the way things were raised. Eggs are smaller, cream was richer, milk was richer. So if you have a background in culinary history and if you're working as an interpreter at historic sites, which I have, you're able to take a vintage recipe and update it for modern use, and also for the sensibilities of the palate, because not everybody would be aimed for, would be game for like buffalo tongue or things like that.
Well, and from its earliest days in those first few chapters, Missouri really did flourish. I mean, back then we had, they talked about exporting everything out. Well, you talk about black bear was very plentiful back then. Bear grease goods were exported, so bear grease was kind of a...
Oh, it was the EEVO for the day, you know. It was very, very popular. And there were people that felt that bear hams were much more preferred than hams produced from pork. But our big commodity in Missouri in those early years was flour. We were the breadbasket of the New World, the Illinois country, which Missouri was part of. In the late 1789, I believe, we produced over 300,000 pounds of flour that we produced milled and shipped to New Orleans, and we traded out for other commodities that we didn't have, like French wines and Spanish goods.
Yes, you go so far as to talk about the table settings even back then. I don't know what era this would be, maybe the 1800s, 1700s, but you talk about St. John and the beautiful place settings. Instead of doing the communal family bowl, they started going to individual place settings and bringing more culture, I guess.
Well, the French had a very real sense of culinary importance, because they remarked that even the humblest of cooks understood the importance of fine cooking, and they used what was available for them. Unlike the English on the eastern seaboard, they would starve to death instead of trying something new. The French embraced everything, like the wild pecans and some of the other wonderful things that are out there.
Since you're speaking about flour, let's talk about what we have on the table here. So let's go to the back towards Suzanne. That's bread that you made.
Yeah, baked it for you this morning.
Oh, it smells so good. Too bad we don't have smell-o-vision. But the flour in that one, anything unusual about it?
No, because it's going to be a whole cracked wheat flour, which was similar to what they would have had. But back in the colonial days, those flours, stone ground, heavier. The average person then would eat 3 pounds of bread a day, which sounds a lot. However, if you think about how much that homegrown, spun flour would weigh,
So very dense.
it'd be very, very dense, very, very heavy. So stone ground meal is heavier than this lighter meal that's produced today.
And then, Deborah, what did you bring today? This is what?
Those are Acorn financiers. It's a recipe from Bull Rush restaurant here in St. Louis. And at the restaurant, Chef Rob Conley actually makes his own acorn flour. But for the home cook, he also mentioned that a substitute would be chestnut flour or hazelnut flour instead. So while it's a more contemporary kind of a recipe, his nod to the past would be the foraging of the acorns and making the flour for the recipe.
So a special kind of acorn would go in there, because I'm thinking of the little squirrels outside the house here. But
Well,
you can't eat those, can you?
well, you can, yes,
Really?
if they're prepared correctly.
all right.
A lot of people think they are poisonous, but if you prepare them, the meat, and then make the flour from that, it's totally edible.
So, Suzanne, you're talking about the acorns and the difference between the two, the old versus newer. How do you know if you're out foraging that we were talking about that we're not getting something that is poisonous?
Well, today I recommend that everyone should take any kind of wild food that you're going to forage to make sure that it is safe by checking with the Missouri Conservation Department. But 300 years ago, they didn't have those guys around, so they used a lot of common sense rules, which was if an animal eats it and they don't fall over dead, chances are you're going to be okay. It may not set with your stomach quite well, however, it probably won't kill you.
I talked about the black bear back in the day, was very abundant. I was shocked to find out pelicans were like thriving way back when, and they became extinct too along the river.
They didn't. They were driven out of the habitat. They weren't extinct. They were driven out of the habitat, like the brown bear. And like the brown bear, the pelicans are back. It's not unusual to see a brown pelican sitting along the Mississippi. And there's records that talk about how tasty they were. Of course, I'm not going to put it on my palate and on my table at this point.
Suzanne, you said you did the first 3 chapters, so more of the older history, and then Deborah took it from the earlier or later years. So going back to the early years, you mentioned something, especially around St. Genevieve, common fields. What were those?
Common fields was a strategy where a government, a settlement outlined a common field where people could go, grow their food, have their livestock, forage for everyone to supply the settlement. St. Louis had a common field that was a little south of Carondelet. And in St. Genevieve, what is wonderful about the space now is the common field still exists. And it is considered through many historians, and they're working on this now to do a little bit more research on just what they can pull from the common field that has survived, which is over 300 years of constant agricultural activity. No other common field or agricultural spot in the country can claim that.
So some of the things back then were black walnuts, biscuits, pawpaw pudding, catfish gumbo, which those were very common. But what's pawpaw pudding?
Pawpaws are considered an Ozark banana, a river banana. They're kind of oval shaped, kind of has a reminiscent of a banana flavor. They're very seedy, but they're very good. You treat them like a persimmon, and you can make some great breads and other delicacies with them.
So is this something people could be foraging for, and or is there a knack to how you would prepare those?
Well, go out and pick them up and put them in your pocket.
Yeah, and that's pretty much it.
Well,
and that's
just like
what they did in the old days.
Let's pick them up.
So let's talk about regionalism, because when I moved to Missouri several decades ago, I had never heard of pork steak. So I was working in Southeast Missouri. Let's have a pork steak. I'm like, what is that? So there are different things in Missouri that are very indigenous to that part of the country, although I am seeing it other parts of the country now, but back 30 years ago, I had never heard of it. So we've got throwed rolls at Lambert's Cafe. We got, of course, gooey, butter cake, toasted ravioli, Kansas City barbecue. So we really could eat our way, Deborah, through Missouri, could we not?
Oh, you can. There's so many cities and towns, no matter the size, that have their own specialty. The city of Springfield is the home of a cashew chicken, and that was started by an immigrant from China, and his family's diner brought Springfield-style cashew chicken that's literally probably in every Missouri city now to the state. And the family, when traveling, was tickled to find that it's even found in Hong Kong. And the small city of Chillicothe is the home of the sliced bread. So every city's got its own food story, and many are very adept at telling that to visitors. And so all you have to do is, we have resources in the book, near the back of the book, that lists convention and tourism sites, and many of those sites already have a lot of the information available for people to either download and take with them, or to read and learn before they go. There's a wonderful new taco trail in Kansas City that won some awards this year. And so food and travel, like I said, it just one drives the other. And just with a little bit of research, you can learn about that region's specialty.
Let's talk about the ethnicity of Missouri, because that had a great influence on how you prepared food, what types of food. So I spoke about St. Gen being French dominant, but then we had Herman, Missouri, and other parts were very German dominant. I'll have Deborah, I'll have you speak to that first in terms of the ethnicity in these different parts of Missouri where people settled.
Yes. Well, I think that the different ethnic groups that came to make Missouri home layers our food history kind of like a cake. From the people that were here before any European settlers came, to the Italians that settled in the area, and then the German immigrants that came and greatly influenced our brewing history and our wineries. Before Prohibition, Missouri had 100 wineries. Most were, of course, closed. Some, when they were able to pivot, like Stonehill, they grew mushrooms in the wine cellars for many, many decades. And now there are people settling in St. Louis and around the city that's bringing their own food culture. You go along South Grand, you can literally dine around the world within 3 blocks. And I just think that the main thing that I hope the book can teach people, as not addition to our historic foodways, but to learn that the culture that's here it has influenced what we eat every day, and to remember that that culture and learn a little bit about something maybe you're not that familiar with while you're having a meal.
My daughter's getting married, and they're serving toasted ravioli for the appetizer because most of the guests are not from here, and they wanted a little bit of St. Louis
Absolutely.
in there. Yeah. Maybe gooey butter cake might be on the menu. I don't know. So going back in history, for folks traveling to the Wild West, really Missouri would have been their last stop before civilized cooking, right, Suzanne? Would that have been one of the
Jumping off spot, yeah, the last place you could get a decent civilized meal with a knife and fork and maybe a china plate.
Is here in St. Louis.
Well, actually, it's a little bit further west.
And a little bit further west.
Quite a little bit, around Arrow Rock and Independence. And that was your last real place where you could have a civilized meal.
And the Kansas City stockyards were also a big influence. What has changed in Kansas City? They're known for their barbecue, and you mentioned what happened in Springfield, but what else is Kansas City known for these days?
Oh, well, they have a very active culinary scene. Wonderful chefs are making Kansas City their home. But around the late 1960s, early 1970s, a gentleman that grew up in St. Louis introduced, to Kansas City anyway, chicken spadini, and craft distilling is very big in that part of the state. Around the state, certainly, but given the history, the Paris of the Plains for the rollicking times in the 20s, and the bars and the nightlife and such that was there, there's wonderful craft cocktails around the city of Kansas City for those that want to explore some of that.
The beverage industry was very interesting to me because it was beyond just the brewery, and especially during that jazz prohibition era that you talk about in one of the chapters. So, Suzanne, share the story with us regarding some of the beverages that had an interesting path.
Well, St. Louis and Missouri in general had a large soda influence, and Vest soda became popular here, was produced here. 7-Up was invented here. Billion bubbling beverages, all that kind of stuff that was all very, very popular here. And it still is. I mean, there is a throwback now to those original old brands, or to recreate those brands, to reestablish them. And people are discovering those old flavors, and that's making them new again, which I think is a fun thing, particularly with some of the newer recipes that chefs are doing, like with the fanciers here with the Acorn Flour. They're discovering what was old is something that's worth putting back on the stove and dishing out again.
The 1904 World's Fair certainly had an impact on food. How and what way? Because we know several things were introduced, not only how it was prepared, but how we ate it.
Well, the St. Louis World's Fair, you have all of these wonderful foods that came together from around the world, and foods that were popularized. Some claim they were introduced, but mostly were popularized. But what changed the way people ate was it was no longer considered ill-mannered to be walking around eating. You could take an ice cream cone, you could take a sandwich, you could eat by just walking around. So fast food was really rather born and became acceptable in polite society. And that really changed a lot on how we ate.
How about the local fairs and state fair? I see all your ribbons. Is this, Suzanne, these are your ribbons?
Yeah, they're
that
mine. It's
from back before you became professional?
Yeah, that's true.
And you won these for what?
Oh, there are a variety of different things, from baking and what have you, but I'm not sure exactly which one is which, but at one time I was the State Fair Grand Champion in pickle making. So these were the blue ribbon bread and butter pickles and dill pickles. And
It's interesting. So, because my family in Perryville, or Purville as I'll say, but Perryville, and they did the canning big time. I mean, had it all. And did you grow up with that too?
oh, well, I grew up with it because I was raised on a truck farm, and we had row crops, tomatoes, cucumbers, things of that nature. And I learned how to preserve in those days, and I was able to take those skills and just have fun to put yourself forward to see what you could do at the fair. Because if you won something at the fair, that was a big deal.
It was. So let's talk about the influence that fairs, state fair, the big one, that it had on our communities and the way we ate and prepared foods.
Well, the state fair had a way to attract people to one spot to show the best of what was produced in the region. And those items changed through the years. There was a time when you had a cooking contest for the best pie making based on lard. You had contests with how many kernels of corn a hog could eat. Those things are gone now, but you've got other things that have taken center stage, like the macaroni and cheese contest. Who cared about macaroni and cheese 50 years ago? But it's a big thing now. You see it on the menus. And that's reflected in the state fair competitions today.
And Deborah, you worked with AAA, traveled through the state, I guess many states, but are folks getting in the car and driving and doing these things and exploring with their families?
Oh, absolutely. I think especially people last year were discovering what was in their own backyard. And like I was saying, all you need to do is a little bit of research to find whatever you're interested in. And I hope that people, when they do visit a new place or revisit a lot of places that they haven't seen in a while because we were all at home. But I hope that they'll try something new to them, that they go to a restaurant that they've never tried before, try a food from a different culture that you've not experienced before.
Go out and forage.
Yeah.
Go out and forage, yes.
Right, and then create.
Pecans are on the ground now.
So pecans are indigenous to what part of Missouri? Anywhere? We can grow them anywhere?
Well, pecans are indigenous to Missouri, particularly around the rivers. And there were pecan groves all through St. Louis, but they were over-harvested. But these pecan groves still are around St. Genevieve County and either on the other side of the Illinois shore. But now is the time to go out nutting. But you can see that these pecans are smaller than what a commercial pecan is today. And I believe you can see that the difference there is just huge. And just because this is bigger, that doesn't mean it's going to taste bigger.
Right.
The taste here is 3 times what that little bit guy is.
Really? I've had my pecan cracker. I guess I can find that out. We'll partake in a little bit of these. So what is this called again?
That's an acorn financier.
And why?
And it's
I would say it looks like a muffin to me.
Right. Well, yes. Traditionally, if the French pastry would have been baked in a little rectangular mold, and some say that the name for it kind of comes from the fact that when baked and turned out, kind of resembles a little gold brick. There's some almond flour in that, a regular flour, cake flour, and then just about a quarter of a cup of a nut flour of your choice, whether it's acorn or chestnut or hazelnut.
So you have recipes in the book, in each chapter, so we can all try them if we want to be adventuresome. Nothing that's too hard to get, right? I don't think so, and most of them are.
No, I think
there are a few.
accessibility is what is a key to the recipes, to make them just not accessible, but also easy to reproduce, because that's the fun of it. You know, you want to taste the past, you want to taste the history, you want to be able to then take that food and transport you from the past to the present.
And as you both were researching, was there anything that stuck out that you thought, I have never heard of this or didn't know this happened? Deborah?
Well, for me, because I was approaching this with much less experience as a culinary historian. So the research, when I found there was a huge tomato canning industry in southwest Missouri that produced canned tomatoes for 14 states in the early part of the 20th century. And while there were some larger companies that were the canneries, many of these people that were producing the canned tomatoes were family farms that used this as sort of a side business to supplement their income. And the tomato canning in southwest Missouri really continued until around the mid-1960s when the College of the Ozarks was doing it. And after that, we just went to the store.
See, this is the reason why I don't eat tomatoes today, because tomatoes were our cash crop.
Right. Well, ladies, thank you so much. It's such an interesting read and something we can be proactive with and interact with by recreating those recipes that you're sharing with us. So thanks for doing the research. And again, it's called A Culinary History of Missouri. So we can try it in our own backyard, but if we want to hit the road, we can.
Absolutely.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you very much.